Hello, student. I'm Professor Smita Jha, and I'm here to discuss with you the form content about Victorian aesthetic under the umbrella term of Victorian literature. And we have discussed various types of thing that was there in Victorian age related to the culture, related to the gender orientation, related to industrialization. But then aestheticism or aesthetic is very, very important, not only in Victorian age, but in any age. Let us see what is there in the Victorian age. So aestheticism was a cultural movement that gained momentum in Britain during the second half of the 19th century. This movement aimed to escape the ugliness and materialism of the industrial age by focusing on beauty instead of utility of art. Its motto was art for art's sake. And we all know that these two aspects, art for art's sake and art for life's sake, were prevalent in English literature, and there were two groups of people. They were supporting one or the other, highlighting the very purpose of art or literature for the society. The roots of aestheticism can be traced back to 1860s. However, it was not until the 1880s that the movement gained considerable popularity. The aesthetic movement is often associated with the French term fin de siècle, or the end of the century, which refers to the closing of an existing era and implies the beginning of a new one. It is often used to describe late 19th century Britain, which was a time when the ideal of the Victorian age were losing precedence and were being replaced by aesthetic values. The established Victorian lifestyle broke down partly because Britain's political and economic supremacy faced new challenges in the form of emerging world powers like the United States. Essentially, the glory days of Britain's empire were coming to an end, which laid the foundation for a new, strictly anti Victorian methods of thought. The aesthetic movement denounced the sober morality and middle class values that characterized the Victorian age and embraced beauty as the chief pursuit of both art and life. The artists and designers of this new aesthetic sensibility crafted some of the most sophisticated and sensuously beautiful artworks of the Western tradition, which in turn reformed the domestic world of the British middle classes. These aesthetics included romantic bohemians such as D.Z. Rossetti, William Morris, and E.B. Jones, and unorthodox men such as J.M. Whistler, who was then fresh from Paris and full of dangerous French ideas about modern painting. Also among these aesthetics were the avant-garde architects and designers such as E.W. Godwin and Christopher Dresser, and the Olympians who were the painters and belonged to the circle of Frederick Linton and G.F. Watt. In literature, asceticism was championed by Oscar Wilde and poet Swinburne. This movement also met with some resistance as it was denounced by masters of the comic operators. W.S. Gilbert and Arthur Sullivan, general skepticism around aestheticism is also evident in many satirical works of the era, which targeted Wilde and Swinburne. The magazine Punch was filled with cartoons depicting languishing young men and swooning maidens wearing aesthetic clothing. One of the most famous of these, the Six Mark Teapot by George Du Maurier, published in 1880, was supposedly based on a comment made by Wilde. In it, a young couple dressed in utmost aesthetic fashion stood in an interior filled with items popularized by aesthetists, an Asian screen, peacock feathers, and blue and white porcelain, comically vowed to live up to their latest acquisition. Enduring against the resistance, the notion of art for art's sake became widely influential in the visual art. Many of the later paintings of D.Z. Rossetti, such as Mona Vana, are simply portrait of beautiful women. These paintings are plainly pleasing to the eye rather than being related to some literary story as in earlier pre-Raphaelite paintings. A similar approach can be seen in the work of Sir E.B. Jones, whose painting, The Golden Stairs, captures the aesthetic mood in its representation of a long line of beautiful women walking down a staircase. This painting also lacks a specific narrative, content, or a deeper meaning. The most famous artist among the aesthetics was the American James Abbott McNeill Whistler. His early painting, Symphony in White Number 1, The White Girl, caused a sensation when it was exhibited after being rejected from both the Salon in Paris and the annual exhibition at the Royal Academy in London. This painting was a simplistic representation of a woman in a white dress standing in front of a white curtain. Its simplicity made it very unique for its Victorian audience, which desperately tried to connect the painting with some literary source, a connection Whistler himself always denied. The artist went on to create a series of paintings, the titles of which generally had some musical connection. These titles were simply intended to create a sense of mood and beauty. The most infamous of these was Nocturne in Black and Gold, The Falling Rocket. This painting appeared in an exhibition at London's Governor Galleries, a venue for avant-garde art, in 1877, and provoked the famous accusation from the critic John Ruskin that the artist was flinging a pot of paint in the public's face. The ensuing libel trial between Whistler and Ruskin in 1878 was really a referendum on the question of whether or not art required more substance than just beauty. The jury decided in favor of Whistler and upheld the basic principle of aesthetic movement. Later, in The Gentle Art of Making Enemies, which is a collection of essays published in 1890, Whistler pointed out the biggest problem for the aesthetic artist was that the vast majority of English folk cannot and will not consider a picture as a picture apart from any story which it may be supposed to tell. Aesthetics drew their inspiration from a variety of cultures and periods. They found beauty in Renaissance painting, ancient Greek sculpture, and East Asian art and design, especially Japanese prints. This rich diversity in their artistic influences is one of aesthetic movement's most interesting characteristics, one which Whistler and others exploited to stimulate new reactions to their works of art. Despite using titles that might seem to establish a literary or historical connection, aesthetic painters were only interested in evoking a mood or prompting vague associations. This unnerved a public who were not used to this new way of reading a painting. Aesthetic artists were also interested in employing the technique of synthesia in their paintings. This means stimulating one sense through another, such as imagery activating a sense of a smell. It produces a layering of responses to the artwork and deepens the viewer's experience. Some key members of Rossetti's circle took a deep interest in the design art. They wished to transform banal furnishing and domestic objects of the middle class home. These designers of a refined sensibility aimed to produce chairs and tables worthy of the name art furnitures and to create ceramics, textiles, and wallpaper entirely unlike ordinary trade wares. It was argued that if furnishings were refined enough in form, choice of color, materials, and their quality of making, they and the decorative art in general could rise to a new level. This would blur the Royal Academy's long-standing strict division between the fine arts of painting, sculpture, and architecture and so-called artisan craft. A perfect example of this approach can be seen in William Morris's Red House. Designed by architect Philip Webb and described by Rossetti as more a poem than a house. Its coordinated style, described as neo-vernacular mellowness with high art seriousness, became Morris's trademark. He stated, "The growth of decorative art in this country has now reached a point at which it seems desirable that artists of reputation should devote their time to it." Morris established a widely influential commercial enterprise focused on the home as a center of simple comfort and beauty with designs based on the simplicity of forms, quality, workmanship, and truth to materials. In the following years, artists, houses, and their extravagant lifestyle became the object of public fascination. The ideal of the house beautiful sparked a revolution in building the interior decoration and ultimately led to a widespread recognition of the necessity of beauty in everyday life. This idea had a lasting impact on architecture as well as the social theory and political thinking for years to come. The aesthetics' eccentric lifestyle invited public fascination, fueling a vogue for all things artistic, whether this was an expansive redesign by a fashionable architect or acquiring a single Japanese fan for the mantelpiece. Manufacturers and new commercial ventures responded to this demand and made distinctive items available at various price points, which were attractive even to a modest budget. The middle class home became the aesthetic focus. Oscar Wilde had much to say about creating the house beautiful. He covered each aspect of domestic decoration and offered commonsensical advice stating, "A stained glass can reduce the glare from a large window and fill a room with more subtle lighting." Japan's forced opening to foreign trade in 1853 revitalized the European veneration of all things Japanese, exemplified by England's passion for old blue and white Asian ceramic. A Japanese inflection featuring asymmetry, flat patterning, simplified form, and elegant surface ornament became a hallmark of the aesthetic vocabulary. As a mechanical form of art, photography was widely embraced during Queen Victoria's lifetime. A practitioner of this art form, Julia Margaret Cameron, was born in India. When her husband retired, she moved to England and began experimenting with photography at the age of 48. Cameron became known for her innovative and unconventional approach to photography, which was closer to painting than to descriptive realism. Cameron often associated with the contemporaneous pre-Raphaelite movement because of her focus on allegorical, literary, and religious subject. Well, Cameron's practice was to take multiple photographies with a small variations in the same setting. Her numerous models were family members, which included her niece Julia Jackson, who was the mother of Virginia Woolf, her servant, her neighbor, Lord Alfred Tennyson and his family, as well as the intellectuals and thinker of the day who were part of her immediate circle, such as Thomas Carlyle, Charles Darwin, painter George Frederick Watts. Cameron gained the respect of the leading painters of her day and established herself as the preeminent British photographer of the 19th century in an era when it was extensively difficult for women artists to achieve recognition. The late 19th century was also a dynamic and experimental period of ceramic production. And the story of the Dalton Pottery and Porcelain Company reflects many of the development of Victorian England. Established in 1815 in Lambeth, South London, on the banks of the Thames, the Dalton Pottery and Porcelain Company initially made stoneware for the domestic market, including storage containers for chemicals, spirits, and other liquids. Well, it expanded in the late 1850s to produce stoneware sanitary products such as sewer and drainage pipes. Sir Edwin Chadwick's report on the sanitary condition of the laboring population of Great Britain, published in 1842, responded to multiple cholera outbreaks in the preceding decade and recommended the use of glazed sewer pipes, which the company recognized as a new source of revenue. Starting from this practical and unromantic beginning, Dalton's factory at Lambeth grew to be known for its decorative ware and porcelain. By the late 1860s, the company had become closely associated with artists from the local Lambeth Art School. Dalton encouraged creativity and justly acknowledged its artists. Queen Victoria was one of the early admirers of Dalton. She ordered vases for Windsor Castle from this company and also knighted Sir Henry Dalton. The aesthetics also transformed the field of Greek studies, which originally belonged to scholars and politicians and stressed morality. The aesthetics re-established the Greek concept of hedonism, or the pursuit of pleasure and beauty, as the pure purpose of life. As a result, the aesthetes became infamous for their habits of passion and excesses. They refuted the strict morality of the age, which was based on Christian principles, and instead followed the philosophies of the pagan Greek. This breakdown in conventional moral conviction among the aesthetes led to the frequent association of decadence with aestheticism. It is also important to note that Victorian England was an age of scientific development, and more specifically one in which the ideas of Charles Darwin flourished. Science is often viewed as a threat to art, and its development are practical while arts are largely abstract. If a society makes a significant shift toward the sciences, there is a chance that the arts will be neglected or made inferior. As a response to this threat to arts, the aesthetes praised Greece as an example of a culture that secured a place for art within a scientific age. They also sought to emulate the example of the Greeks. This is not to say that the aesthetes were adverse to scientific innovation. Contrarily, they too favored the triumph of scientific progress over superstitions. Crucial to the aesthetic movement was a late Victorian trend of being dandy. Generally, dandy, as the term is employed to denote someone who pays particular attention to their appearance. Their dress is often eccentric yet elegant. But in late Victorian England, to be a dandy symbolized the elevation of the artificial over the natural. The opening lines of Oscar Wilde's phrases and philosophies for the use of young is, "The first duty in life is to be as artificial as possible." One example of such attraction of late Victorians towards artificiality is that they preferred urban rather than rural settings and were particularly fascinated with London. Furthermore, Victorian dandies aimed to uphold a high level of sophistication and valued wit as a measure of such. Many aesthetic writers such as Oscar Wilde, A.C. Swinburne and Walter Pater were well-known dandies. As a legacy of aestheticism, we have a rich theory of aesthetics today. In his book, Art, published in 1914, Clive Well, the English art critic, talks about aesthetics emotion while trying to develop a complete theory of visual art, in the light of which the history of art from Paleolithic days to the present becomes intelligible, a theory which would give a definition and meaning to terms such as good drawing, magnificent design, unfit, ill-organized. The basis of Bell's theory is that there is a particular kind of emotion provoked by works of visual art, the aesthetic emotion. This same emotion is provoked by every kind of visual art and works as diverse as Saint Sophia and the Widows at Chartres, Mexican sculpture, a Persian bowl, Chinese carpets, Giotto's frescoes at Padua, and the masterpieces of Poshin, Piero della Florence and Cézanne. Other theorists like Terry Eagleton state that aesthetic is not in the first place about art, but about both body and its whole region of human perception and sensation, because beautiful objects powerfully affect the sensitive body. Terry Eagleton discerned beauty's use as a tool of political hegemony. With the power of beauty's influence in mind, the construction of the modern notion of the aesthetic artifact is thus inseparable from the construction of the dominant ideological form of modern class society, and indeed from a whole new form of human subjectivity appropriate to that social order. An analysis of feminized beauty as depicted in Victorian literature reinforces the influence of this type of aesthetic artifact, wherein text in various forms, from the visual to the literary, craft a new dominant ideology through the use of beautiful body across genres, through the strategic implementation of feminine beauty. Victorian authors gave material form to their impressions regarding their society's values in adherence or at variance with contemporary culture. From 1860 to 1900, the aesthetic movement initiated sweeping artistic and design changes, and its concept of middle-class lifestyle and domestic environment echo even into our own time. The aesthetic movement provided a challenge to the Victorian public in an era when art was supposed to tell a story The idea that a simple expression of mood or something merely beautiful to look at could be considered a work of art was a radical idea. Finally, this movement is often considered to have ended with Oscar Wilde's trial, which began in 1895. However, in his assertion that a work of art can be divorced from narrative, the ideas of aesthetic movement were an important stepping stone in the road towards modern art. Today, aestheticism is acknowledged for its revolutionary renegotiation of the relationships between the artist and society, between art and ethics, and between the fine and decorative arts, all of which paved the way for the art movements of the 20th century. With this, I conclude the discussion, and next time again we shall meet with a new topic in question. Thank you very much.